Human Endowment Elizabeth R. Hansen Endowment Fund was awarded to Mary Schultz. Tonight we have Jean Osmond with us. She has been the co-founder of the Dyslexic Foundation of Minnesota. She has worked with learning disabilities for 34 years. She works in the Reading Center in Rochester, Minnesota, as well as in consultation with Carleton College. Here is a piece part of a thing that Jean wrote. It has been my experience with Carleton College students with whom I have had the opportunity to work that, with some training in reading and writing words of higher level language structure, with new insight into this learning style and professors' teaching styles, and with support and encouragement from professors, intelligent students are able to go on and achieve in undergraduate and graduate college studies to a very satisfactory level. Jean has helped me personally after the Mayo Clinic diagnosed me having a problem. My diagnosis was of dyslexia. Tonight she will be sharing some of her experiences, and at this time I would like to introduce Jean Osmond.
Thank you, David. I've had butterflies all afternoon, and now you all look perfectly human and normal, and I'm not quite sure why I had butterflies, but I guess I always feel responsibility. I know how busy college people are, professors, students, graduate students, and it's a responsibility to take an hour and a half of your time and try and get a lot of information in that short period. I was going to suggest that you move because I stand here and I use this a lot. So if there is an empty chair and you want to move or move your chair or what helps, please do so so that you can see. My plan for tonight is I would like to touch just quickly on the concept of learning disabilities. There's lots of question about learning disabilities and the place of dyslexia under that category, and I would like to just touch on it very quickly and try and clarify that for some of you. I have a pertinent case history. The student that I saw a week ago Friday would like to just share the pertinent information from my work with him, thinking that would be helpful for you. Touch on some relevant statistics so that you know what sort of problem this is and how frequently it occurs. Take a quick look at the college population because they have a somewhat unique situation in all of this, and then leave time for questions and answers. And it's the item number 5 that I'm not terribly good about. I get going and forget to look at my notes. But I will stay as long as anybody has a question. My sister-in-law is a very patient, loving lady, and she'll stay to make sure I don't have to walk back to her home. So I will stay as long as there are questions and as long as I can be helpful to people here. And if you have urgent needs and want to leave at the end of the short question and answer period, please feel free to do so. The concept of learning disabilities in general and dyslexia specifically, just a quick definition of learning disabilities. I might state here, I used to say it very quietly, the term learning disabilities is a very difficult term to deal with because most students who are diagnosed as having a learning disability are not learning disabled. Most of those students are people who have different learning styles for whom people have not found an appropriate teaching approach. So the term learning disabilities is a very unfortunate one. But it is the term included in the national laws. It is the term that schools have to deal with, and therefore students must be given that kind of label in order to receive recognition, in order to receive the help that they really are needing and are certainly eligible for. The definition of learning disabilities in the national law included in the Handicapped Children's Act of 1975, Public Law 94-142, it states that children with special learning disabilities exhibit disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using spoken or written languages. There may be manifested in disorders of listening, thinking, talking, reading, writing, spelling, or arithmetic. They include conditions which have been referred to as perceptual handicaps, brain injury, which is, according to the physicians and the neurologist at the Mayo Clinic, they have real concern about that one because many of these children have no indication of brain injury. Minimal brain dysfunction, it sounds as though parts of their brain don't function, and yet they do, it just functions differently. Developmental aphasia, etc. They do not include learning problems which are due primarily to visual, hearing, or motor handicaps, to mental retardation, emotional disturbance, or to environmental disadvantage. Many of those items can coexist. A child can have a number of problems, and learning disabilities or difficulty learning can be one of them. The more the problems that a child has, the more careful the diagnosis, and the more people have to work together in order to make that diagnosis appropriate. A learning disability is a handicap which affects the manner in which the individual takes in information, retains it, and expresses the knowledge and understanding they possess. The most serious and common deficits in LD adults are in reading comprehension, spelling, mechanics of writing, math computation, and problem solving. Less frequent but no less troublesome are problems in organizational skills, time management, and social interpersonal skills. For most LD adults, language-based and or perceptual problems are evident. Would like to share with you an overview of the term learning disabilities. There are probably 30 or 40 subcategories included under learning disabilities. Wouldn't have time to talk about them and anything else. Would like to just touch on several that are very important and then look at a couple of others in more detail. But under the heading of learning disabilities, it's dyslexia, verbal auditory processing difficulty, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, attention deficit disorder, and I'll touch on that, dyscalculia, which is the unexpected difficulty with math and calculating, directional insecurity, not being able to find your way around, to get someplace and not be certain how to get home again, social imperception, not being able to read the social cues that other people are able to deal with very easily, mechanical inability, and dysgraphia. And dysgraphia is the unusual problem in penmanship. Let me just touch on those. Would like to point this out that of the children or the adults or the individuals who are considered to have some kind of learning interference with learning ability, about 80% of those are involve language, either written language, spoken language. And the other 20% involve the other kinds of learning problems, the dyscalculia, the dysgraphia, etc. I did put for dyslexia, I would like to just put this up. It's the writing of a young man who was in the 8th grade, and the verbal IQ was 92 and the performance IQ was 128. He was the oldest of 4 children, all boys, all of whom were dyslexic, and father's an engineer at IBM, and he was also dyslexic and completed his engineering degree because his wife read all of his engineering books to him. In case you can't decipher dyslexes, what he said was, and I typed it up as he wrote it so that you could perhaps see a little better, and I'll read it for you, but it's, you can hear the 128 IQ, but you can see the dyslexia if you can read it. Can those of you in the back see it well enough? Okay. Straight ahead, there was the meanest, ugliest, biggest, and tallest, most grossest bunny rabbit I've ever seen. I could see it descending on me with its little beady teeth, gnashing them as he came. I slowly raised my shotgun and took one shot. It didn't even stop it. It was now only 40 feet from me, but something told me I was okay, especially when it picked up a carrot and asked, "What's up?" 128 IQ, but the dyslexia, the difficulty with spelling patterns, choices for letters, decisions between things like Y and EY, double letters, the O and the A shows very clearly. Auditory, there are people who hear perfectly well. When you send them for a hearing test, can hear and pass the hearing test, but have difficulty holding on to the language, the sequences of language that they are able to hear. It is not an acuity problem, it is a retention or processing or memory problem. There are a number of labels or a number of terms that are used for that. Central auditory processing dysfunction, auditory processing learning deficit, auditory dyslexia, receptive language disability. For an example, one of the tests that we give and have given for years gives the student unassociated words, starting with a group of 2 and going on to a group of 8, unassociated words, and give them to the students without their being able to see your mouth. And they have to give you back the words. They are very familiar. And one example, college senior, happened to be Carleton, college senior, major in poli-science. And when I gave him that test, he functioned at a 6-year-old level, which puts his auditory memory, his ability to hold on to language, his inner tape recorder functioning at approximately a 1st grade level. I could hear it in his speech when he talked because I would ask him a question. There would be a long pause and then he would answer in phrases, usually not complete sentences, and that's one of the things that you sometimes get used to hearing. But nobody had recognized this in him. And the reason he was referred to me was that he had tried 4 foreign languages and had failed them all. The one advantage that he had, 2 advantages that he had, well, 3. He must have been very bright to have been able to compensate for that serious language processing problem. He could read fine. His visual memory for language was very secure, so he could actually read the words. He couldn't always remember what he'd read, but he could at least read the words, and his spelling was fine, so he could do better at taking notes. And he was extremely motivated and very willing to work hard and spent hours and hours and hours on his studies to compensate for a problem that he really didn't understand. He knew there was something wrong, but he didn't know what it was. I would like to clarify attention deficit because it's the latest addition to the umbrella of learning disabilities, and it's a very confusing area under learning disabilities, and I'm not sure I'll unconfuse it, but I certainly will try. There are 3 major categories under the heading of attention deficit. The diagnosis that comes attention deficit now. And I asked my favorite pediatrician at the clinic, who was dyslexic, if he would clarify for me his version of attention deficit disorder in words of 1 syllable that I could understand. And what he did was draw a line and put ADD at one end, attention deficit disorder at one end, and hyper at the other. And he said there are children, and children with this problem grow up to be adults with this problem. There are children whose bodies are in high gear all the time, and they're just constantly in motion. No one has difficulty diagnosing a truly hyperactive child. It's very obvious. Teachers have no difficulty. Parents know from the very beginning when they bring the baby home that something's a little different about this child. He doesn't sleep. She doesn't sit still. She's into everything. He's constantly on the move. So that's a very much more obvious kind of attention difficulty. The pediatrician said at the other end of the continuum are those children with attention deficit disorder, and they're the children whose minds are in high gear all the time. The body can be sitting still, but the mind is in high gear all the time. My associate's working with a little boy right now in the 3rd grade, and his comment to her is, "I hear everything." Absolutely everything. The cars going by on the street, the conversation in the next room, all of this. And when he's in a classroom, has a very difficult time tuning out that kind of other sound and listening to the things that he's supposed to be concentrating on. But he sits perfectly quiet, so nobody would know by looking at him that he has an attention problem. Only if you talk to him, listen to him, or try and work with him can you realize that something's not quite right. The diagnosis, at least at the Mayo Clinic, if it comes back attention deficit disorder plus, it means that the child has both his mind and his body in high gear all the time. And a child with that kind of problem is really struggling with 2 interferences, major interferences that make it difficult to sit and concentrate. And then I asked the pediatrician about the child who has difficulty maintaining alertness, and where does it come on this continuum? And he said, as far as the medical field is concerned right now, it doesn't. It doesn't come on that continuum, so he drew another line, and then he put narcolepsy on that line. And narcolepsy is the unexpected difficulty in staying alert, in maintaining enough alertness to concentrate on what you're supposed to concentrate on, which is quite different from trying to slow your brain down to concentrate. And the child with the narcolepsy, or the inability to maintain alertness, also goes unrecognized because he sits quietly. If he wiggles, it's usually because he's trying to stay awake. Some of those children with the inability to attend wiggle to stay awake and then are considered hyperactive. But what they're really doing is trying to maintain alertness. And that can create major problems for individuals. Interestingly enough, and the reason why it's a puzzlement why they're not on the same continuum is that the medication for all 3 of these attention problems is essentially the same. And what happens is for those children that are at the extremes, the medication tends to bring them into sort of an average, normal attention ability, maintaining ability that we in our society will accept as workable. The math continuum, if you look at the math, it's at the upper end of the continuum, there are people who have superb mathematical ability, superb grasp of concepts, no difficulty. It doesn't matter how you teach them, they will understand and be able to deal with math concepts. If they're dyslexic, they might not be able to memorize the multiplication tables or give back the algebraic theorems verbatim. But if they have a strong math ability, a math concept ability, they'll understand the theories and they'll understand the concepts beautifully. The dyslexia would get in the way of the writing. In the average range of the population, those are the children for whom the math curriculums generally fit. And at the lower end of the continuum, there are children who are extremely bright, who have difficulty with math concepts right from the very beginning. My associate has a son with an IQ of 162, measurable IQ, and he struggled with the relationship between adding and subtracting. And when he finally learned that, then he struggled with the relationship between adding and multiplication, and then he struggled with the relationships between fractions, decimals, percentages, and ratios. And understanding the concepts of math was unusually difficult for him from the very beginning. And the medical diagnosis and recognition of that then is dyscalculia. I would like to show you dysgraphia, the unusual difficulty in penmanship forming the letters. This has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence or the ability to read and spell. But the problem with dysgraphia, this is readable. This is a college freshman. This is readable. What you don't see on this is the length of time it took her to do it. It was excruciatingly slow, and many of the people with true dysgraphia tell us that by the time they're through with a writing assignment, it also becomes painful. The effort to control the pencil or the pen on paper becomes a really painful procedure. This young lady also happens to have dyslexia, but the past president of the National Orton Dyslexia Society, a little lady by the name of Margaret Rawson, who took up flying at the age of 70, is dysgraphic. And if we asked her to write these very same sentences, it would look very much like this. Her solution was, she had superb language skills. Her solution was the typewriter. And nowadays, the dysgraphics that have gotten through high school and into college, their solution is the computer and the word processor, and it's a godsend for them. I would like to share just quickly a case history of a young man named Mark. I had a call from Mark about 3 weeks ago, and he asked if I would retest him. I saw Mark when he was going into first grade, and I went back and looked at his record and photocopied the page that he wrote at that time. The Mayo Clinic had done an IQ, and it came out average. But Mark was unable to form many of the letters. These were the capital letters, had difficulty. I dictated the alphabet because he couldn't remember it, and had difficulty with letters such as G, confusing the G and the F. That's the E, F, G, and H, confusing those letters. Could not recall the S. This was his rendition of the letter S. That and that, trying to make the letter S. The U and the V he confused, the X, the Y, the Z, and I asked him to write the numbers, and even at that point, and he had been studying the numbers in kindergarten, he was still unable to orient the numbers correctly.
He was kindergarten at this time?
Going into first grade, yes. Okay. The nursery school teacher, his nursery school teacher said he seemed immature. He was held back in kindergarten and put in 1 year, held out of kindergarten and put in, so he was a year older than the other children in his class, and attended nursery school for a second year. His kindergarten teacher recommended him for transition class, which is the class, the full year class between kindergarten and first grade in Rochester, and he was accepted in that program. He had difficulty forming B's and D's and differentiating which was which, P and B, N and U, the U and Y, and E and G. And he had every indication of spoken language processing problems as well. He was unusually restless, had good, strong, large muscle control, poor pencil control, and was already exhibiting symptoms of being overwhelmingly frustrated at school. He had difficulty following sets of directions and would say, even at that time, as a beginning first grader, you have to tell me what to do one at a time. He had tutoring the summer before first grade. His family thought that after that, they had heard the diagnosis of dyslexia and thought everything was going to be fine after that. He started in an LD, Learning Disabilities program, in third grade and stayed from third until sixth. And at that point in time, you didn't have to be quite so far behind to receive special education services as you do now. But he was considered eligible then. And his comment to me was, when I saw him 2 weeks ago, I really feel I stopped learning at that point. He had German in high school, received a D, and said it was an absolute disaster. The teacher told me I had the lowest score in the class. He always did his homework. He said I did my homework, but I really couldn't learn with my homework. I had to go to class to learn and listen to the teacher, but that didn't always work either. And his comment was, I'm getting sick and tired of living with a disability. Father thought I was just putting in enough effort, not putting in enough effort. In one English class, I got A's in all my compositions. The tutor sat with me and corrected everything I wrote. To get a paper done, I had to rewrite it at least 10 times. He was majoring and finishing up a major in a large university in forest products. And last term, he decided that he wanted to go to dental school. He's had 3 formal IQ scores, and every one of them has gotten lower, so that according to formal IQ testing, he's less intelligent now than he was when he was going into first grade. And yet I maintain, and the psychologist at the clinic's not very happy with me, he couldn't have. The IQ score this time came out below average. He couldn't have below average intelligence and do what he's doing academically with his degree of language learning disability, and I'll show that to you. I gave him the test for auditory memory to find out how well his inner tape recorder works. He could not repeat 4-syllable words, and at his age, with his academic record, he certainly ought to be able to. A 4-syllable word. He should be able to repeat 7 digits and possibly 8. He could hold on to half of the 5, the groups of 5, and often what he would do would be to give back the digits, but give them out of order. So he could not hold on to a sequence of 5 digits. I gave him the word repetition that I showed you for the other Carleton student. I didn't have the heart to show him what his score was on that test because he came out at a 5.5-year-old level. That would put his auditory memory functioning at a kindergarten level. And you would never have known it to talk to him. He talked perfectly intelligently, related school history, talked about the things that had happened to him. Absolutely no clue that he was having that degree of problem. I also gave him the sentence repetition test, which is just the simple words with simple concepts. I would say the sentence, all he had to do was say it back. And even on that one, he was functioning at an 8-year-old level. That puts his auditory memory on just that test at approximately a 3rd grade level. So it's based on this kind of language processing disability that tells you that he simply can't have low average intelligence. Skill level on silent paragraphs, if he within the time limit, he was reading at 11th grade level, silent reading. I wasn't listening to what he was saying. If I allowed him all the time he needed, it came out at grade 15-7. On the silent vocabulary, if he read it, he could finish it in time because it wasn't so much reading, so much comprehension. Read the statement, find the word that completes a statement. 13th grade level. When I read it aloud to him, it came out at the 15th grade level. His actual reading of content material was early 8th grade level. It's all right, put it on a profile and forgot. That's his paragraph reading in the time allowed, 11th grade. Vocabulary was mid-13th grade. Actual reading, 8th grade level. Decoding, 8th grade level. Words, grade 8.7. Spelling, grade 8.1. And I did look at his errors because they're quite typical of the bright dyslexic who's somehow been able to compensate in some way with something. The abroad, aboard, same letters, different order. Looked at lip, read it as hip. Looked at persevere, read it as preserver. Usurp and read it as ubsurb, which is the PB confusion still, and it was occurring back in first grade. Looked at alcove and read it a clove, so for him the L just skipped over one place. Looked at subtlety and read it as sub-lefty. Looked at philosophers and read it as philophosers, and did not know that that was not the way to pronounce it. Looked at astronomers and read it as astronomers, and looked at redoubts and called it rebouts, which is the BD confusion. And then I wrote some of his spelling errors so that they would be quite obvious also. Recovered without the E, that's to be competition. Professor, now this is a senior in college. Professor. Unusual. Religious. Politician. Undoubtedly. Schedule. By the time you're a senior and you've gone through high school and college, how many times have you seen the word schedule in print? Incidentally. Immediately. Trifle. And alleged. The typical kinds of bright college student confusions with language. How do you explain this kind of phenomena? How can you explain that a student can be very bright and still not be able to learn to read and spell, want to desperately and still not be able to? How do you explain it? Would like to just touch very quickly on a couple of different kinds of explanations. There's a remedial reading teacher or a junior high reading instructor in Rochester, Minnesota that says this problem doesn't exist. And I have argued with her for years that it does exist. I could introduce her to about 3,000 charming individuals with dyslexia, all ages. And finally, the World Federation of Neurology, with neurologists from all around the world, met in Dallas, Texas, and for 4 days talked about the phenomena of dyslexia, trying to agree on a definition. And their definition was, it was neurologists, pediatricians, psychologists, and educators trying to discuss all of this. And this was back in 1968. And they came up with two definitions, which the National Orton Dyslexia Society still uses as its sort of semi-official definition. And dyslexia, specific developmental dyslexia, is a disorder manifested by difficulty in learning to read despite conventional instruction, adequate intelligence, and social cultural opportunity. It is dependent upon fundamental cognitive disabilities, which are frequently of constitutional origin. The brain anatomy studies are showing that the disarrangement that occurs that creates the problem of dyslexia generally happens at about 3 or 4 months gestation. So that a child with this kind of difficulty visualizing language patterns has that problem from the very beginning. You just don't recognize it until they're put in the position of having to learn to read and spell and deal with written symbols. Simple definition of dyslexia: a disorder in children who, despite conventional classroom experience, fail to attain the language skills of reading, writing, and spelling commensurate with their intellectual abilities. The reason that I've been involved in this field for so long is that my associate had an uncle who worked with the original thinker in this whole field, a man by the name of Samuel Orton that started his work in Iowa, Iowa City to be exact. And this was back in the 1930s. and as a neuropsychiatrist recognized that there were bright people, bright children who were unable to learn to read and spell. In studying those children, Orton also found family history. There were family incidences, others in the family with similar kinds of problems. And because of the number of these cases, he became interested in the possibility of a neurophysiological problem underlying this difficulty, and went back to New York and studied it. And another neuropsychiatrist by the name of Paul Dozier joined him. And Dr. Dozier worked at the Pennsylvania Hospital, the Children's Hospital in Pennsylvania, and tried to find some way to explain the phenomena to parents, to teachers, and to the children who were struggling with it. And the only thing that he could decide that would work would be to use the bell-shaped curve. I assume that you all understand the concept of the Gaussian curve. If you look at if you give enough human beings an intelligence test, you will find people that score superbly high and very high within the average range, below average, and then those individuals that have severe retardation. If you could give a test to measure how well people could remember language and how words looked, you can't sit inside people's heads and do this, but you could give tests to measure how well you thought the visual memory for language worked. You could put that on a continuum. And there are people who have absolutely superb visual memory for language. And our sort of generic term for them is photographic memory. The most extreme I've ever heard was a professor at Harvard. You could show her a page of print, and she could run her eye down the middle of the page. And 3 weeks later, she could recall the print on the page so exactly that she could write it backwards from the bottom up. They could show her a graph page filled in with random order and give her a blank graph page a week later, and she could reproduce it perfectly. My associate's husband is a world-famous psychiatrist, and he had to prove to the dean of medical school that he could remember the pages in his medical book, because he would write answers on the test word for word, and he had to convince them that he was not cheating, that was the way his memory worked for him. Those people that have superior visual memory for language form, written language form, often learn to read before they go to school. They learn to read off the cereal boxes and the TV sets and the road signs, etc. They can sit in daddy's lap and read the storybooks at night and literally process and file away the images of words that make learning to read and learning to spell extremely easy. Most of us fall in the average range, and if we see words over and over again, we begin to hold on to the memory of how those words look. And then there are a group of individuals who do not have that strong visual memory. The vision is normal. The intelligence can be perfectly normal. The motivation, marvelous. The support at home and the kindly, friendly teachers and all. But the memory for language form, the symbols that make language, just does not work very effectively. And they have difficulty on down to word blind. That's the 10% cutoff right there. And the agreement among the experts in this area are that about 10 to 15% of the population falls in that range with visual memory. I had an adult student and he said, "So what, Jean? That doesn't mean anything to me." So I called the librarian. It's the equivalent of the blind, the deaf, and the retarded put together. So I asked the librarian for the national census figures, and it was 3.5 million people. So there are approximately 3.5 million individuals struggling with that kind of problem. The most severe word blind adult that I've ever seen in my professional career was a very bright farmer who'd made a fortune farming, and his comment to me was, I watch a lot of television, I learn a lot from that, and I've come to recognize the Campbell's soup labels because I see the advertisement on TV. So I can go into a grocery store and walk up and down the aisles and find the Campbell's soup can display. And then I just hope I get a kind I like. They asked him to be on the school board. He couldn't do it because he was terrified somebody would hand him something to read and he wouldn't be able to read it. They asked him to be a 4-H leader and he couldn't do it. And the reason that he came to our door was that he ultimately had a nervous breakdown. And he and his psychiatrist felt very strongly that one of the primary reasons for the ultimate nervous breakdown was his inability to read and his lack of understanding, both his family and for himself. One has to always keep in mind that the visual memory for language has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence. There is no relationship whatsoever. Thomas Edison, Winston Churchill, Westmoreland, Patton, many incidences of very bright, very capable people, psychiatrists at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, pediatrician at the Mayo Clinic, engineers at IBM, who are struggling with these kinds of problems, varying degrees. And the auditory pathway, very quickly, if you can imagine, if you will, that you have a tape recorder inside your head, that's to record the language that you hear. Nothing wrong with your hearing, only something wrong with the tape recorder inside that's supposed to record what people say. And if we could test for that, and we try when we see students, there are people that have absolutely superb tape recorder minds. Remember very easily what people say. Go to listen to a lecture, walk away and quote verbatim what the lecturer said. No difficulty memorizing things like history dates, the algebraic theorems, all of that, very easy. Most of us fall in the average range, and if we hear something once or twice or 3 times, we begin to be able to hold on to it very well. On down to the word deaf. And there are children, my associate and I visited a classroom for the deaf, elementary level classroom for the deaf. There were 3 children in that class that the teacher felt were unusual in some way, and when we got to talking to her about it, they could recognize the world sounds but could not deal with the word sounds. And we wondered if they weren't children who were word deaf. The student whose case history I just shared with you, as far as his auditory memory is concerned, he's right down there as far as his ability to hold on to spoken language. And yet you would not know it when you talked with him. I was in a position of working with Carleton students and had to try to find some way to make it pictorial concrete, because many of those students had strong pictorial concrete memories. If they could see something, if they could make a picture of it, they could hold on to the information more effectively. And so I drew a diagram to try and explain to them that our intelligence, the level inside of us that deals with concepts, cause and effect, relationships, how things work, that's entirely separate and a higher level of functioning than our memory for details and specific areas. And I put the camera system for the visual memory for language. And students who have difficulty there have visual dyslexia. And then the tape recorder for language. And you see there are 2 kinds of tape recorders. We have a musical tape recorder and a word tape recorder. And they don't function together. If you've listened to the Hooked on Phonics advertisement on the radio, you'd think that's a wonderful way to learn to read. But if you look at the memory systems, the musical memory does not operate with the verbal memory at all. If you happen to be strong in both, you learn both the music and the words very easily. If you have a strong musical memory, you can learn the tune and have difficulty with the words. If you don't have a very good musical memory, you can learn the words and not sing the tune. Those are separate memory systems. The math, the memory system for math, the memory system for things, being able to visualize pictures, building diagrams, to be an architect. You can be an architect and still not be able to read and spell. A couple of more examples of dyslexia, and I would like to make the point that the young child recognized as having dyslexia, recognized as having difficulty with the visual memory for language, grows up to be an adult who has difficulty with the recognition and the memory of language. What makes the difference in between is the way they're taught to read and write and deal with written language. This young man, his name is Dan. When we saw him in the 4th grade, he had superior IQ and was given the sentences to write in blue, and what he wrote in black you can see. Be a good boy. And still at the 4th grade level, he is confusing B's and D's. Come in on time today. Eat 3 apples. He ran to school. He'd been in school for 4 years, 5 years.